We're going to kick off the show talking a little bit more about the Michigan sweepstakes. So, back in the beginning, we knew there were a lot of little incentives, right? You get a free donut from Krispy Kreme, get a free beer from here. But now you have governments getting involved and really trying to up the game to incentivize people to get the vaccine. But it may be legal, although it took Michigan a while to figure out the legalities around this and how to make it happen. That's why we're so late to the game compared to some other states. But is it ethical? To talk a little bit more, we want to bring in Professor Mark Navin. He is the professor and chair of philosophy over at Oakland University. Great to have you back with us. How are you today?
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me, Ronnie. How you been?
How was your holiday?
It was good. It was I was vaccinated, so I was with some friends. Good
It
times.
it feels a lot different this year, doesn't it?
What a difference a year makes.
Yeah, but what a year it's been.
It's been quite a year. It's been quite a year.
So if we can kind of just jump into the question, because I have people in my circle of friends on both sides of this issue. Some were the very first ones to sign up to get vaccinated. Others still haven't done it and really have no plans to do it, especially as we start to go into the summer months and all of the restrictions have been lifted. So now the governments are trying to say, hey, there's a carrot hanging out here and it has millions of dollars behind it. Should they be doing that in an effort to try to reach some of these goals that they have set to get people vaccinated?
It's a great question. And we don't really know the answer because there's so little evidence about whether these programs work. So some of the preliminary evidence shows, at best, a very moderate impact on increasing vaccination rates. And so ordinarily, you wouldn't spend millions and millions of dollars to have a tiny impact. But frankly, given the stakes, given the sort of worries about the increase of the new variants, we need to probably throw everything we can at the wall at this point to try and increase immunization rates. So ordinarily, I would think this is probably a pretty wasteful thing to do. It certainly didn't incentivize me to vaccinate. I already got vaccinated, but I signed up. I was very happy to. And as you were saying on the previous segment, there's a risk of it backfiring if people are feeling that they're not allowed to sign up for it, right, because they participated in the trial, or some people raising worries that maybe it seems unfair. People are kind of being bribed now. But I think it points to a deeper problem with the vaccine rollout, which is we spent 99% of our money on the vaccines and on the natural science, which is great, but vaccines aren't helpful unless people take them. And we've spent almost no money on the sort of behavioral science approaches to getting people to be persuaded, be educated, to have acceptance and uptake. And it just speaks to a broader sort of lack of mobilization of public health in our communities. We just don't fund it appropriately. We wait for an emergency and we throw money at the problem. It's like after every war, standing down your military and like standing it back up again every time there's a war. We just don't have the institutions in place to effectively do public health. So when we're desperate, we start scrambling and throwing millions of dollars at lotteries. Hope I win.
I know. I think I went on that day that it was announced, but our internet was down here in the office, and I was like, "Oh, I need to sign in," because I'm like, I want my chance. I will say, in the very beginning when I heard about this, because it was leaked to the media a couple days earlier, I was kind of like, "Oh, I should have waited." I could be getting a $50 gift card from Oakland County. Free Krispy Kreme, all of that, but. I do think it was good that she is adding people back in. If you've already been vaccinated, then you can go ahead and, sign up for this. Do you think that was smart on her side? And from an ethical standpoint, did she really kind of need to do that?
So it's a nice point. I think, as you said before, it's bad PR if people who were, the first to sign up are actually being excluded, even though they were probably doing what's right before other people were. I'm not so worried about it from a sort of ethics or fairness point of view. I mean, one way to think about fairness is to ask, would I trade places with the person who I'm saying is being treated better than me, right? And I actually wouldn't, right? I don't care how many glasses of beer or donuts you offer me. I would not have given up my chance to get a vaccine back in January, which I was able to get one because I have an appointment at the hospital. I was glad to have those extra months of vaccination, and no amount of donuts would have bribed me out of it. So I don't feel the fairness worry. I actually don't think many people do, but I think as a PR issue, it's important. that we're, frankly, because these are taxpayer dollars, and we should be, even if they're being inefficiently spent, I think everyone should have access to the benefits that are coming from them.
Well, when we talk about tax dollars and how they're being spent, we always know that. But I will say, you hope the one thing that comes out of this is that we do start to understand and recognize that we need to address some of the other surrounding issues, because I think the deeper conversation really is, why do we have so many people not willing to be vaccinated? And is that part of the government's messaging throughout this pandemic?
I mean, it's a great question. I mean, on one hand, it's actually a miracle that so many people have gotten vaccinated. Because I'm so pro-vaccine, I take for granted everyone else loves vaccines, but that's part of my identity, right? And so obviously I'm going to get vaccinated. But for many people, asking them to take a newly developed medical intervention when they're not currently sick is actually a pretty big ask. And we've had dramatic success. So look, it's not as much as we would have wanted, but I think it's quite good. It's worrisome that the lines are sort of flattening out. It's worrisome that this is a politically polarized issue, in particular, not just around questions about vaccine safety and efficacy, but seriousness about COVID. So I talked to friends who work in ICUs and emergency departments, and they say that the people that they're seeing who are coming in with COVID, they're often in denial that they have COVID because they're convinced that COVID is not a serious disease. And so there's been a messaging sort of failure and a persuasion failure, both around the vaccine, but also around the seriousness of the disease. And some of that was politically motivated by the previous administration. And some of that is just deeply entrenched right now in ways that I don't know how you move past.
Yeah, once that message is out in the beginning, and even at the first, it was going to be for 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks ended up into 15, 16 months. But from the very start, it was the mask issue. Don't wear a mask, wear a mask, wear a mask. And so from the very beginning, when you have those mixed messages, it doesn't build a lot of confidence within the public. Again, we're talking with Mark Navin. He's a professor and chair of philosophy over at Oakland University. And so when we're looking at, the vaccine and the messaging, if it was handled better in the beginning, do you think we'd have a better outcome now?
I think that's true, but I think that's probably true for everything. If you handled it better, the outcome would be better. Here's another way of putting the point. I think we have deep structural, social, and political problems in this country, and that there's no way, those don't stay in silos, right? They spill over into all our issues. And so, for example, we're at the lowest levels of trust in core political institutions that we've had since they started measuring it. We're at the deepest levels of polarization around core issues. And frankly, we're at the highest levels of politicization. Everything is politicized now, from the sports you enjoy to the grocery stores you go to. And so it's no coincidence that these toxic parts of our broader culture have spilled over into questions of public health and even whether we like vaccines or are afraid of diseases. So I think you're quite right that the issues and the causes of these problems are very deep and going to be really intractable and going to require commitment from all of us, because a stable, diverse democracy is a fragile and precious thing, and we have not done enough to keep ours up, and it is at risk.
Professor, though, I think back to 9/11 when we were attacked and you saw the country come together. We were united then. And I remember the lines for people to donate blood, in New York City. And sadly, they didn't need the blood. But how we came together, both sides of the political world as well. And here we are in a crisis, a global crisis, and we're not seeing that unity.
I think that's quite right. I would say, though, that people are coming together, but they're often coming together in kind of oppositional communities. So sometimes we talk about people who are refusing vaccines as if they're stupid or evil or selfish or irrational. And I think on some level that's true, but that's just a really simplistic analysis. Often what they are is they're part of collectives. They're part of groups of people that are telling persuasive stories to themselves, at least, about the world that make them feel powerful, that make them feel like they're on the inside and they're part of something. And so I think, the sort of grand conspiracies, be it about the vaccines or about American politics, are actually a way of groups coming together and feeling good about themselves coming together. But even where in the case of vaccine misinformation, what they're doing is really harmful.
And do you think social media is a contributing factor to that? Because, back in the day when everyone was trying to get the polio vaccine, we didn't have the access to the internet and that constant 24-hour feed of information, a lot of it, like you said, being misinformation.
So I think, of course, contemporary social media plays a role in accelerating some of these trends, but I think we need to resist sort of naive histories. So, for example, in the polio vaccine rollout, we did the largest clinical trial ever in the history of this country. Over 1 million school children, the polio pioneers, participated. And we often hold that up as a story of, look how everyone signed up for it. What we don't say is that hundreds of thousands of parents refused to send their kids to school because they didn't want to participate, and that there were organized communities of resistance during the polio trials. And frankly, conspiracy stories and a paranoid tendency has deep, deep roots in American history. I mean, going back to the 19th century and before. I mean, for example, if you've ever been to DC and you've seen that the Washington Monument has 2 different colors of brick on it, it's because the Know Nothing Party, a conspiracy political party, took over politics in this country because they were convinced that like American politics was being run by the Pope and the evil Italian immigrants. And so they shut down the construction of the Washington Monument they thought was part of a papist conspiracy. This sort of nonsense is part of American politics forever. And one reason is it feels good for people to feel like they're on the inside of uncovering the deep, dark secrets of our country. And so, yeah, social media is part of it, but it's an American disease. It's a human disease. And we need better tools to address it.
You know what's fascinating as well is when we come up, when we face a crisis such as this in our country, we tend to cherry pick the memories or the history parts that kind of feed a narrative. And so, like, for me, the one I just said about the polio vaccine. And here we're really seeing the other side, that this has always been, there are 2 people on every side always when it comes to so many of the issues, not just vaccines.
Well, and for example, when we talk about mandates, people are talking about, well, we need to crack down on employer mandates. We need the school mandates to work better. We need to not let people get out of it for religious reasons. But actually, there's been widespread resistance to mandates since their very introduction in the 19th century and early 20th century, and often really expansive exemptions, because otherwise you'd have a riot on your hands. Frankly, Americans have resisted forceful vaccination throughout their history. And the only times it's really worked have been in the military or in prisons, or we figured out in children. But as a country, we have a long history of resisting forceful public health, which is one reason why I'm all in favor of throwing money at lotteries and at education and outreach and sort of cultural messaging, because some people in public health say, well, we could fall back on force. And frankly, that's a political non-starter if you're paying attention to American politics today and if you know anything about our history.
But I also think about people want to go back to the Tuskegee Airmen and the experiment with the Tuskegee experiment. And when we talk about that, how do we gain the confidence in some of the communities that have been resistant to the vaccine when we have that part of our history that, overshadows the work of the vaccines?
So that's right. I mean, the Tuskegee experiment from the 1930s to the 1970s is a sort of black mark on American public health, because it was financed and run by U.S. public health. But I want to clarify that the sort of injustices and inequalities and even just day-to-day disrespect in our healthcare system for members of disadvantaged groups continues to this day. I mean, there's, for example, all kinds of evidence that Black people's pain is not recognized as seriously by physicians, that Black people, to get various kinds of either transplants or other surgeries, have to have more serious symptoms than white people do. So I appreciate the appeal to history, and I think we need to keep that in mind. But as you're indicating, decreased trust and acceptance among African Americans and other disadvantaged communities is often much more grounded in contemporary and recent forms of disadvantage, inequality, and disrespect.
So if we're targeting some of the communities, a lot of times it is the Black and brown communities right now that have been more reluctant to get the vaccine, because here in Oakland County, we've almost reached 70%. We're one of the highest vaccinated counties in the state of Michigan. So Wayne County being one of the lowest, the city of Detroit. So with that, if we're trying to entice them with lotteries, are we doing more harm, Or at the end of the day, the good overcomes what could be seen as a negative?
That's an excellent point. So there's some evidence that shows you can have a backfire effect because people will say, if you have to pay me to get to the vaccine, it must not be safe or effective, right? If you're having to bribe me to do it, there must be something wrong with it. And so there's some evidence that that actually can have a backfire effect. And just back to the point, if you've got a community that you've abandoned, and there have been consistent cuts to public health and all kinds of other institutional sort of outreach in Wayne County and across Michigan, if you've really abandoned populations when it comes to questions about their health, it's a bit rich to show up with a vaccine and then start blaming people when they don't take it, right? So it's a bit rich to show up and say, oh, we're all in this together, solidarity, let's form together as a community, when frankly, you've given up on various communities, and in Michigan's case, given up on its cities. It's indecent, frankly, to blame people for refusing or being skeptical of vaccines, given that very recent history.
That's such a good point, Professor. With that, I know your time is tight. Anything maybe we didn't touch on that you want to add?
Well, I think one of the big questions coming down the pike is going to be about children and children's vaccine, because we're doing pretty well, as you say, 70%, but that's 70% for adults. And of course, kids can get the disease and it's less severe for them, but they can also transmit it. And as we're starting to gather more in families and larger groups, we really need to be promoting vaccine for children. And it's a slightly different calculation there, right? Because of course, COVID's less serious, but still serious for them. And the vaccine has some, although very, very low rate of side effects. And so we need to think about what we're prioritizing when we're prioritizing vaccine for kids. I got my kids vaccinated, but it's primarily because I don't want them to infect vulnerable older people. And I don't want their bodies to be incubators for new variants, because Delta variant's scary, but there are scarier variants coming if we don't get this under control.
You know, that's a great point, because I think that's going to be a big discussion in a lot of households over the summer months as we go into the fall time and going back to school. But also we know that the trials are continuing on children younger than 12. But what makes it hard is then you have a headline out of Saginaw where a 13-year-old died following getting the vaccination. And of course, at this point in time, they don't know if it was related to the vaccine. However, that can play into the hesitancy of the parents.
It's exactly right? And so there's lots of uncertainty. There's lots of fear. And of course, when it comes to children, we're in our culture so prioritized by safetyism. We care about minimizing risks on all sides. And one way to do that is to vaccinate. But of course, the vaccines have risks too. And so people are easily worried and easily afraid. And so I think successful rollout of the adult vaccine is something to prioritize now. But you're quite right. We need to start talking about how to message around vaccination for children, because it's a different risk profile. And frankly, we just think of children in our country and risks for children in quite a different way than risks for adults.
It's going to be interesting, too, as we continue on. We know Henry Ford Hospital is going to require the vaccine for some of its employees, rather. But, Professor, a few years ago, we went to Africa and we had to have a whole list of vaccines prior to going, and we didn't really think twice about it. Is this just really because it's new?
It's because it's new, and so there's some reasonable fear, but it's also because it's become politicized. So on the higher education level, for example, my university is now going to require vaccines for students living in the residence hall, but there's almost no public university in the country in a state that President Trump won in the 2020 election that's going to have a vaccine mandate. Almost all of the public university mandates are in states that Biden won. I mean, this is just a clear example of the sort of political polarization around these issues. And so I worry because, of course, diseases don't stop at state borders. And so we need to find ways not just to solve the epidemiological issue of getting disease incidence down, but the political issue. And that is going to be a really thorny one for years to come. And I worry that while mandates are helpful, of course they work, they also can have this political backfire that I'm very worried about.
Well, Professor, we so appreciate your time, but let's hope that enough people get vaccinated and we can put the pandemic behind us. I mean, COVID's not leaving us, but if we can get back to life as we knew it, that would be a great thing. So we so appreciate your time.
Thanks, Ronnie. Enjoy your summer.